Well, if you have a Bible, meet me in Mark chapter 3 this morning, Mark chapter 3. And what you need to know as we're working our way through the Gospel of Mark, what you need to know about today is at this point, Jesus is becoming more and more well known. And that means there's a lot more friends and a lot more fans, but he's also making a whole lot more enemies. I mean, people are already talking about and making plans on how to kill him, and we're not even out of chapter 3 yet. So chapter 3, verse 7 says, Jesus withdrew with his disciples to the lake, and a large crowd from Galilee followed. And when they heard about all he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan and around Tyre and Sidon. So the word's getting out about Jesus, and people are talking. His reputation is beginning to spread quickly. As it says there, they're talking about all that he is doing. And I just want to point that out because it shows that Jesus wasn't just having a quiet time. Now, he did do that. We've seen that already in the early part of Mark, that Jesus would get up early in the morning as God's will for us to do. But he'd get up early in the morning. He would slip away from the crowds and go pray. But Jesus was also a man of action. And I think it's really, really important to point that out because we've got to keep those things balanced in our lives also the way Jesus did. Now, I don't know how many of you are like me, but there's times, when you hear a good sermon or a podcast or a book, we have this tendency to overlook the application that we need, and instead we immediately start thinking about other people who need that application. Oh man, that's a really good sermon. I'm going to send this to Bob because Bob is the worst, and Bob really needs to hear this sermon. But here's what I want to ask this morning. What's the message? What message does God need you to hear? I mean, let God deal with Bob himself. And I would say with this passage, or at least the early part of the passage, is that God, or that Jesus Sabbathed, but he also got to work. That he was a contemplative, but he also wore work boots. Now, how does that apply to you and me? Well, here's what that means. Maybe some of you are this kind of workaholic achievers. You get more done by noon than most people get done all day long. And as a result, you're kind of burning the candles on both ends. Your relationships aren't great. Your marriage is suffering. You're not spending that quality time with your kids. So you work and you work and you work and you accomplish and you accomplish, and you just kind of need to slow down and take a Sabbath. You need to read books like The Ruthless Elimination of Hurry. But others of you, maybe you need to put the book down and accomplish something. Maybe you need to work. You don't need the Sabbath yet. You just need to do something first. So he says there in verse 8, then he says, when they heard about this, all that he was doing, many people came to him from Judea, Jerusalem, Idumea, and the regions across the Jordan, around Tyre and Sidon. Now, when you and I look at that, we think, well, that's just a bunch of names. I don't know what it means. Well, this is a map to kind of show you. I know it's kind of hard to see, to help us to visualize what's going on here. At the top where you see the little lake and there's an arrow, and it's hard to see on the TV screens, but that's the north side of the Sea of Galilee. That's where Jesus is. And so Mark is telling us that I want you to know that regionally, this is where all the people are coming from. And if you look all the way down toward the bottom on the left-hand side there, you have Idumea. It's a long way away. Now, you and I take that for granted because, the world we live in, you can get on a plane now, and you can be on the other side of the world by the end of the day. But the first century, they're traveling by foot and by camel and by donkey. So it was a big deal to make your way all the way up to go spend time with Jesus. The primary point that Jesus was drawing people to himself, both then and today. And what was drawing people to Jesus was three things. It was his power, his presence, and his words. And that's what he's doing then. That's what he's doing now. He draws people today by his power, his presence, and his words. And it reminds me what John says in John chapter 12. He says, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. And I love that visual picture there because as a preacher, it takes the pressure off. As a follower of Jesus, it should take the pressure off. Statistically speaking, most of us, including pastors, are a little bit intimidated about sharing our faith with other people because we don't want to be rejected. We don't want to be mocked. We don't want to look like a fool. We don't think we have all the answers or enough answers to people's questions, and we think we just don't know enough. And so Jesus said, look, hey, just take the pressure off. Just lift me up. I'm the one that does the drawing. I'm the one. It's not your convincing. It's not your answers. It's not your intellect. I mean, what you just make sure that you do is make a clear view toward Jesus, his words, his power, his presence. Would you just clear the way that people can have an encounter with Jesus? So, verse 9 then, he says, because of the crowd, he told his disciples to have a small boat ready for him to keep the people from crowding around him. For he had healed many, so that those with diseases were pushing forward to touch him. Now, this is the first recorded command that Jesus gives to his disciples after the invitation to follow him. So the very first command that Jesus says is, hey guys, will you go get a small boat for me? Now, it doesn't sound very spiritual, does it? But there's two practical reasons here. One, Mark tells us that the crowds are crowding around Jesus, so he needs to create a little bit of space. Now, on the north side of the Sea of Galilee, if you don't know, as soon as the shore hits the water hits the shore there, it's immediately uphill. And so it's kind of this reverse amphitheater. So they're crowding around him. The people are all standing on the hillside there. Jesus' back is to the water. So he's like, hey guys, go get a small boat. I just need some space. And I'm going to get in the boat. I'm going to go a little ways offshore so I can have some space. The second purpose was whenever he would teach, they don't have sound systems like we have today, so he would use the water like an amplification system for his voice to be carried for those on the hillside so they could hear him. So Jesus says, hey guys, can you go get me a small boat? Now listen, Jesus does the drawing and the saving, but he invites us into the facilitating. So Jesus wants you to use whatever you have and whoever you are to be involved in the ministry that he is doing. And guys, I can't get my head around this, that the God of the universe would invite you and me into what he is doing. Because we're like, me, I just don't know enough. And he's like, you don't need to know enough. Just bring me the small boat. And he wasn't inviting them to do a job that he didn't want to do. He's inviting them into the ministry that he's already doing. Jesus was more than capable of getting them his own small boat. But he said, hey guys, I want to involve you guys in this. I don't need them, but he chose to involve them. We'll see in chapter 8 that another large crowd, 4,000 people, gather around Jesus, and it's been 3 days since they ate. And so Jesus is getting concerned, so he goes to the disciples. He says, look, guys, we need to feed these people. And the disciples are like, Jesus, where in the world are we supposed to get enough food out here in the wilderness to feed all these people? And Jesus doesn't say to them, hey, funny you should ask. Watch this. Watch what I'm about to do. Instead, what he says there in Mark chapter 8 is, how many loaves do you have? Jesus asked. Now, did Jesus need the bread? The answer is no. But he chose to use what they had on them. So there's no way 12 apostles or 12 disciples had enough bread to feed over 4,000 people. So he goes, how much bread do you have? I don't need it, but I want to involve you guys. Guys, it's so important for us to get our heads around, because there are so many more who have responded to Jesus in salvation that haven't responded to say, Jesus, here I am, send me. Whatever I have, I give to you to use. And the reason why is oftentimes we disqualify ourselves from, it's because we just think we don't know enough, or we're pinned to the shame of our past. We think God can never use somebody like me. Or we have a tendency to look at other people's boats that they bring to Jesus and go, man, that's a spiritual yacht, and all I have is this little John boat or this little dinghy. And Jesus is like, just give me whatever you have available. Listen, he doesn't need you. He wants to involve you. And can I say, for those of you that maybe your spiritual life has plateaued, or your time in God's word has become bland, maybe the culprit is you're receiving something from God, but you're not necessarily allowing that to flow through you to other people. So let me ask you, what small boat is it that God is asking you to get ready? Maybe for some of you, it's to volunteer and lead in our children's ministry, to draw young families in, to build that department back up, and to stay with them all through elementary school. To say, you know what, I'm going to commit to these small group of kids, these group of kids, and I'm going to spiritually mentor them all the way through school. I mean, do you have any idea the blessing of how many people's lives have been changed, even through adulthood, because somebody with a deep, deep passion and relationship with Jesus poured into young kids at a young age all the way through? Some of you, maybe your small boat is, you know what, I'm going to volunteer in the new food pantry we have, and I'm going to make sure we reach and love our community. Maybe for some of you, your small boat is, you know what, I'm going to take dinner over to our neighbors, and I'm just going to be intentional about building a relationship with them. Listen, God doesn't just want to work in you, he wants to work through you. And if your spiritual life has kind of reached a plateau, it's quite possibly it could be the culprit. Because, look, the reason why the Dead Sea is called dead isn't because there isn't water flowing into it. It's dead because water flows into it, but nothing ever flows out of the Dead Sea. And we got a lot of Christians like that. You know, podcasts and sermons and Bible reading and Bible studies and devotions and constantly receiving, yet nothing flows out. I mean, think about how many sermons and lessons do we listen to when we come and sit through, but we never apply. We never use. Ever. He goes on, verse 11, he says, whenever the impure spirits saw him, they fell down before him and cried out, "You are the Son of God." But he gave them strict orders not to tell others about him. Now, the impure spirits, of course, these are demons. These are the fallen angels, oftentimes referred to as unclean or impure spirits. They're following Jesus around. And that shouldn't surprise us because Jesus, he's their enemy. He's ushering in his kingdom as opposed to their kingdom. So they're keeping close tabs on him. And you've heard me say before that the birthmark of every believer is a bullseye. That oftentimes Satan will leave you alone until you become a threat when you start following after Jesus. And the demons, you know, they're very well aware of Jesus' actions and his movements, and they're not far away. They're looking in the shadows. And here's what's really unusual. Mark says they fall down. And they cry out, "You are the Son of God." Now, that really struck me when I was working on this sermon. Because I think it's interesting that we come into the presence of God, the creator of the universe, the one who said yes to us waking up this morning and said, "I will give you another day," the one who created and holds everything together. And we come into his presence and it looks like rigor mortis has set in already. But the demons fall down and say, "You are the Son of God." And people say, well, why did Jesus tell them to stop? I mean, is it not true? Is that statement not true? I mean, you would think he would let them declare it even though they're demons, but he says, be quiet. Why? Well, here's why. Because he doesn't want the evil spirits declaring who he was first. Listen, guys, they were saying the right, true thing with the wrong motive. And that was enough for Jesus to tell them to shut up, to shut them down. He says, look, you're not going to be the method to which my name gets out. Now, here's the application and the warning and encouragement for you and I. He tells us in Matthew chapter 7, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter into the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of the Father who is in heaven." But chapter 15, he says this, "These people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me." So here's what we learn. Jesus just doesn't hear the confessions of your mouth. He knows the motive of your heart. And the reason why he's telling the demons to be quiet is the demons can say the right thing, but only a true disciple can say the right thing with the right heart. See, your mouth matters, but not alone. Anybody can say anything, but only if your heart is convinced. If it isn't convinced, then there's this inconsistency. It's called empty religion and hypocrisy. He says what really matters is the confession of your mouth, but also the posture of your heart. Romans chapter 10 brings these two things together and gives us the assurance of that. He says in verse 9, "If you declare with your mouth Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved." I mean, it's period. It's not like it's a question. It's not like it's hypothetical. It's not a what if. It's a statement of fact. And it's truth, and it's a promise that we can be assured of. But then he goes on in verse 10, he says, "For it is with your heart that you believed and are justified. It is with your mouth that you profess your faith and are saved." So the application is God is looking for yielded hearts, not just confessing mouths. Now, one of the top questions that people ask, typically those who have not yet given their life to Christ, and they use this as a question, as an objection not to do so, they'll say things like, well, If you're saved by grace through faith, and salvation doesn't seem to be fair. And they'll go on to say something like, are you telling me that if somebody lives their entire lives as corrupt, horrible person, hurting all kinds of people, but on their deathbed, that the last second they profess Jesus as Lord, you're telling me they get to go to heaven? And then somebody who lived their whole lives as a good person, doing all kinds of really, really good things, but they never profess Jesus as their Lord, even on their deathbed, you're telling me they have to go to hell? Now, how's that fair? How's it fair that the first person gets to go to heaven because they at the last second confess Jesus and the other person doesn't? Well, that's a great question. And I got three things for you to consider. Number one, it's simply this. If you say salvation isn't fair, you could not be more right. We wouldn't want salvation to be fair. Because according to Jesus, there isn't anybody who can live up to the righteous standards that God requires as a holy, righteous, just God. All our righteous acts, the Bible tells us, are filthy rags in the eyes of God. And salvation is a great exchange where we give Jesus our sinfulness. As a matter of fact, that's the only thing we bring to the salvation equation, is that Jesus swaps out our sinfulness for his righteousness, and we are clothed with his righteousness. It's hardly fair. And I'm grateful it's not, because we would not stand a chance. The second thing is nobody's getting into heaven on a loophole. What I mean is we kind of create this scenario where somebody's lived this really, really horrible life as if God didn't see it. And then right at the end, they didn't really have a change of heart, but they confessed Jesus as Lord. So, they get to heaven and they get to stay there when they die. Listen, they don't show up in heaven and have Jesus meet them at the gate and Jesus go, oh man, you tricked me. Nobody's getting into heaven on a loophole, because God knows the heart. It's like Jesus with the conversation on the thief on the cross. We can't tell if the thief's heart was changed, but Jesus knew. He knew it was enough to say to him, you will be with me today in paradise. And the last thing is, maybe for those of you that maybe you're using that reason to not give your life to Christ, can I say gently, stop using this straw man deathbed confession as an excuse to not give your life to Christ, because we're not talking about a hypothetical deathbed confession. We're talking about your confession today. And if you know Jesus is prompting you, then you need to surrender to your life to Jesus today. Verse 13, then he says, Jesus went up to the mountainside and called to him those he wanted, and they came to him. He appointed 12 that they might be with him, and he might send them out to preach and to have authority to drive out demons. These are the 12 he appointed: Simon, to whom he gave the name Peter; James, the son of Zebedee, as his brother. To them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder; Andrew, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon the Zealot, Judas Iscariot, who betrayed him. Now, Mark has already talked about Peter, Andrew, James, John, Matthew the Levite, who came to him. He doesn't give us the backstory on the rest of the guys. He just kind of gives us this list of disciples, 12 disciples. Now, 12 is not a random number. There's a practical reason and there's a spiritual reason. The number 12, it's a pretty good size for a small group, because it's not too big where everybody can't contribute, and it's small enough where everybody knows each other. But the other thing is 12 is representative of the 12 tribes of Israel. 12 in the Old Testament represents authority and power. Now, I just want you to know that these are 12 ordinary, flawed, very diverse men. They would have had very much different opinions on social and political issues. And Jesus is calling them to be part of his kingdom that is coming, that they could never do alone. And you need to know that Jesus says that he called them on purpose. He wasn't just taking what he could get. This was not the B team. And now, humanly speaking, they're not the most qualified candidates. Mark says Jesus called those he wanted. And each of these guys have unique personalities and characteristics and sin issues and strengths and weaknesses. And it should greatly, greatly encourage all of us, because if he could use them, he could use us. So right now, some of you have a gift of faith. You came to Christ quickly and early in life. From the little time for a little kid, you put your trust in Jesus. Maybe you're the only one in your family that put your trust in Jesus. and you've had no issues, no crisis of faith. You've just been following after Jesus all your life. Others, your relationship with Jesus is more like a gradual crock-pot conversion. And you know what? Jesus takes both of them. God knew what he was doing when he created you, and he sees you, and he calls you. So what I want to do through this remainder of the time we have is I want to go through this list that he gives us, Mark gives us, because our tendency is to skip the list of names when we read it in the Bible. But I don't want to do that with this, because there's a story behind each of these guys that should greatly encourage each one of us. So here's what I'm going to ask you to do. I'm going to tell you who they are, what their strengths and weaknesses were, their flaws, and the things that Jesus could redeem, and how they died, and what we can learn. And I just want you to see if there's anything in one or more of these people, these disciples, that you can reflect in your own life. And it should greatly encourage you that if God could use them, then he can use you. Now, the first one is Matthew. We talked about Matthew last week, so we won't hit him very hard today. But, of course, he worked for the Roman government collecting taxes for Rome against the back of his own people. That's why his own people hated him. And he has the shortest conversation with Jesus ever. I mean, he's in the middle of his shift. Jesus comes and says, hey, follow me. And Matthew's like, okay. And no 2-week notice, nothing. He just leaves and follows after Jesus. Matthew is a numbers guy. He's highly educated. But I think since he's a tax collector, obviously there's a love of money, which is a real problem for him, which is why I think he records a lot of Jesus' teachings on money. He talks about the treasure that Jesus records. Wherever your treasure is, there your heart will be also. That's a teaching that Matthew would have learned from Jesus. And as Christians in America, we have been taught to pursue money, a love of money. And that's a struggle for a lot of us, same issue. So I want to encourage each of us as Christians that if you're in that position of Matthew, don't just use it to build your kingdom, but leverage it to build God's kingdom. The ancient writer Socrates tells us that Matthew preached in Ethiopia in the court of royalty, that the king's daughter was converted to Christianity through his preaching. Tradition says that because of that, he was stabbed to death by a swordsman in Ethiopia. Matthew inspires me. And maybe if you can relate to Matthew, because can I say this? If you can connect to Matthew in any way, can I ask you the question, are you like Matthew where you're ready and willing to follow Jesus wherever he calls you? If it's a change of job or change of a location, from one degree to another degree, from one relationship to another relationship, knowing that your best ability is your availability. And like Matthew, maybe you just need to say to Jesus, okay, Jesus, the answer is yes. Now what's the question? That's Matthew. The second person is Simon the Zealot. Now he's the exact opposite of Matthew. Zealot describes not only his personality, but what he did. Zealots were political extremists. You know any of those? He believed paying taxes to Rome was a sin against God. What did Matthew do? He collected taxes for Rome. The Zealots were revolutionaries, and they could be very, very, very violent. Matter of fact, they would carry these curved daggers in their clothing. They would work their way into a political crowd, and they would assassinate Roman sympathizers. Rome called them domestic terrorists. So right off the bat, he calls Simon the Zealot, Matthew the tax collector, who would have been completely opposite in their ideas. Jesus says to both of them, I need you guys in my small group. Zealots would have wanted to kill guys like Matthew. Jesus called both of them. And here's what Jesus did with Simon. He took a guy who was willing to kill for an earthly kingdom and taught him to die for an eternal kingdom. And tradition says that Simon went all the way to Persia to preach the gospel. He was eventually killed by being sawn in half. And he says, Jesus, he took that zeal and that passion and that level of commitment that was used in destructive ways. Now he was willing to fight for what he believed in, but Jesus takes all of that and he sanctifies his zeal. He didn't change his personality, but he redirected it. He directed the fire and the zeal that was in him for the good, and he became passionate about saving lives, just as it was about killing the enemies before. Now, look, this is what I've learned in church. I've learned that you give me a Christ follower who one time was passionate and committed to something of this world, sometimes very bad, terrible things. They were committed. They were all in. But if they come to Christ, let me tell you something, they will serve like nobody else. They will have passion and zeal for Jesus, and they're great protectors of the church. I love these people. The next one is Andrew. This is Peter's brother. He's known as a connector. He's always introducing people to each other and to Jesus. I mean, he brought Peter to Jesus. He brought the boy who had the loaves and fish to Jesus. He brought the Greeks in John chapter 12. And he shows us that he really cared about forming connections. Eventually, he was killed in Greece. He was crucified on an X-shaped cross. He wasn't nailed, but he was tied to it. Tradition says he hung there on that cross for 2 days, preaching the gospel to the tormentors until he died. Now, he wasn't looking for attention. He didn't ever write a gospel. He wasn't part of Jesus' inner three, but he wanted to connect people to Jesus. And you have all these type of people that they don't want to be the center of attention and get credit. And we learned that's a great thing. Maybe some of you're just natural connectors. You're always going, man, I need to introduce, Sarah to Jill or Bill to Ted. And you're more likely to invite more people to church in 1 year than people do their entire lifetime. And you don't always get credit, but you will be a part of somebody's story for all eternity. When you get to heaven, people are going to crowd around you because they're going to go, because that connection you had with me coming to Jesus, I'm here because of that. The next one would be Thomas, Didymus, the twin, the doubter. I mean, he's famous for doubting. I mean, that's unfortunate. And the reason why, of course, Jesus, after his resurrection, the disciples seen him. Thomas hasn't seen him yet. He's out buying chicken wings or something. I don't know. But he's not there. He's like, I'm not going to believe until I see the scars in his hands and on his feet. We call him Doubting Thomas. I think, you're going to get to heaven and go, hey, man, there's Doubting Thomas. And he's going to go, really? Come on, man. I said other things. I mean, stop it already. I think he gets a bad rap. I don't think he was doubting. I think he's a realist, and I relate to that. I get that. But he's also courageous. He tells us in John 11, he's talking about Jesus. He said, let us also go that we may die with him. That's Thomas too, but his nickname isn't Thomas the courageous one. He's labeled Doubting Thomas. And here's what I love about Thomas. He just doesn't just believe, but when he sees the evidence, he's willing to change his mind. He doesn't believe easily, but out of that belief comes this strong conviction of faith. Tradition says he traveled further than the other disciples with the gospel. He ends up in India in AD 52. He's eventually speared to death there. Some of you may have the spiritual gift of faith, and others of you have the gift of skepticism and cynicism. And I call it a gift because you're not easily duped. Some of you are practical, and you're unsure, and you're not easily convinced. And I want you to know that oftentimes the biggest doubters become the boldest believers. Now, here's why. If you aren't easily talked into faith, you're not easily talked out of faith. And so as you grow in your faith, your courage will make an impact. The next is Philip the pragmatic. He's analytical, he's data-driven, he's rational. In almost every recorded interaction in the Gospels, Philip is talking about logistics and facts and procedures. When Jesus wanted to feed the 5,000, he specifically asked Philip where they could get the bread. And I don't think that was an accident. I think he knew Philip would come up with an answer. So Philip, he didn't over-spiritualize it. He didn't go, Jesus, with you, everything is possible. He's pulling out the calculator. He's crunching numbers. And here's his answer. He says, Philip answered him, it would take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite. Wow, Philip, did you do that math in your head? When he's talking to Nathaniel in John chapter 1 about Jesus, he doesn't have emotional hypes, or he uses specific data points and details. So he says to Nathaniel, hey, we found the one that Moses was talking about in the law. And of course, Nathaniel knew the law also. Nathaniel's like, well, could anything good come from Nazareth? I mean, he's always kind of snarky and cynical. But Philip does not respond emotionally, but very practical. He just tells them, says, well, just come and see. Just come and meet him. At the Last Supper, Jesus is talking about, about what's to come. And so the disciples are a little bit confused. And Philip is a visual learner, so he's kind of lost. And he says, Jesus, I don't know what you're talking about. So he says, Lord, show us the Father, and that will be enough for us. Translation, Jesus, I don't know what you're talking about. Show us pictures. For those of you who love object lessons, you're a visual learner. Philip is your guy. Maybe your spiritual gift is details. Look, can I say, please, we need people like that in our church. People who bring a structure, detail people. Not just, You have people that fly by the seat of the pants. We also need people who have structure and detail to bring order to what God wants to do here. However, I need to remind you that God's power is beyond human math. Because with God, oftentimes the math doesn't math. I mean, with God, 2 fish and 5 loaves doesn't equal 7 things. It equals a feast for over 5,000 people with leftovers. So you have to make sure there's room for faith that with anything with God is possible. The next is Bartholomew or Nathaniel, the quick thinker. Now, he's kind of snarky. He's a quick thinker. He's blunt. He's quick-witted. He's really honest. In John chapter 1, Philip's invitation goes to see Jesus. Jesus looks at him in verse 47, and he sees Nathanael approaching, and he's never met him before. And he says there in verse 47, when Jesus saw Nathanael approaching, he said of him, "Here truly is an Israelite to whom there is no deceit." "How do you know me?" Nathanael asked. Now, it's important you read it with that tone, because he's not going, "Well, how do you know me?" He's going, "How do you know me?" In other words, you don't know me, dude. Yeah, it's a challenge. You never met. You don't know what you're talking about. And he says, Jesus answered, "I saw you when you were still under the fig tree before Philip called you." Now, what's that about? Well, it's a euphemism for deep private study of the Torah. What Jesus said to him is, "I saw you under the fig tree." What he's saying is, man, I saw you searching the scriptures looking for the truth when you didn't want anybody to know you were searching for the truth. And it flipped him. It tells us in verse 49, then Nathanael declared, "Rabbi, you are the Son of God. You are the King of Israel." Man, you know, some of you have quick minds and faster tongues. And you process things very quickly. And so maybe you're a little bit snarky, a little bit cynical. This is your guy. I mean, he went on to minister in Armenia. He converted the king of Armenia to faith. So his brother had him killed because of it, and so it cost him everything. And by the way, you'll see that 10 of the 12 disciples were all killed for their faith. So you got to ask, if it wasn't true, why would they die for their faith? And what would you give up for Jesus? It's believed that Nathanael suffered the most horrific martyrdom of all of the 12 because they skinned him alive and then beheaded him. So that teaches us that faith is not just blind acceptance. If you think that's what it's about, then think again. If you're intellectually honest enough to ask tough questions, then be intellectually honest enough to accept true answers. And use your quick wit to solve problems that are keeping people from knowing Jesus. Don't just use your thoughts to tear things down, but use it to build things up. The next one is James, or little James, the son of Alphaeus. He's probably the disciple we know the least about. Some think he's the brother of Matthew, but he kept a really, really low profile because he was stuck between two prominent Jameses. You have James, part of the inner circle, the three. Then you have James, the half-brother of Jesus, who was not one of the 12, but he was a leader of the church of Jerusalem. He wrote the book of James. This James, though, if you're the middle child, you can relate to him. He has no recorded words whatsoever in the Gospels. Nobody would have listened to him anyway because he's the middle kid. Eventually, he was stoned to death in Jerusalem. James would be one. He's going to do what needs to be done without taking any credit. There are some of you in this church, you don't need a platform to be known. You are faithful behind the scenes. I love these people. They are so humble and they get so much done for the kingdom. You serve behind the scenes, and you just need to know, even if nobody notices or nobody gives you the credit, God sees you, and your reward in heaven is going to be great. The next one is Judas Iscariot, the betrayer. What scares me about Judas is he spent 3 years with Jesus. He ate meals with him. He walked with him. He spent time with him. He saw all the miracles. He listened to all the sermons, completely unchanged. So it's sobering to know that you can grow up around all the things of God without being changed by God. People who call themselves Christians but whose hearts are not aligned with Christ. And here's the deal. How do you tell? You can't. In fact, Jesus tells this parable about the wheat and tares and the sheep and the goats. He says, you don't know. But he says, one day I'm going to separate them. And you can know somebody's heart. However, you can discern from the fruit in their lives. And with Judas, there are these tales going on in his life. John chapter 12, there's this beautiful scene where the sinful woman comes. She's anointing Jesus' feet with this expensive perfume. Jesus is receiving her worship. Guess who doesn't like it? Judas. Chapter 12, verse 5 says, why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. Sounds like a really noble question, doesn't it? It sounds really spiritual and reasonable to ask that question. But listen, it's motivated by selfish and evil intent. Verse 6 says, he did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. As keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to what was put into it. So we learned that not everyone who asks questions asks with good motives. He ultimately betrayed Jesus and he took his own life. So listen, if anybody's ever betrayed you, someone who said they would always love you, always be with you, and they turned your back on you and walked away, they wounded you on the way out, Jesus knows how that feels. And if Jesus had people betrayed him and he was the perfect Son of God, don't be surprised if people will betray you as well. And don't let that cause a bitter spirit to come into you, because even though Jesus was betrayed, he still fulfilled his mission. The next one is Thaddeus, or James, or Judas, or son of James. I mean, Thaddeus had the biggest PR problem there was, because his name was Judas. I think that's why he's going, hey, from now on you call me Thaddeus, okay? I think it was his nickname. In the book of Acts, he calls him Judas, son of James. In John chapter 14, when John is writing about Jesus talking, and Judas interrupts, it says, then Judas, not Judas Iscariot. I think he's making it very clear that we're talking about a different Judas. And I think because his association with Judas the betrayer, Thaddeus becomes the patron saint of lost causes and hopelessness. Because in the early days, some of the Christians, of course, that developed into the Catholic Church, developed this practice not just praying to God, but praying to saints and to disciples. And they didn't want to pray to the wrong Judas, so they were very careful. So they go through all the other guys, so they resort to praying to Saint Jude. And man, if you've ever wrestled with your reputation and what people think about you, if you've ever been slandered and your reputation has been maligned, God can redeem it. And God can use what once hurt your reputation as a beacon of hope to others. If you've ever been hit, God can respond and use it in a big way. And there's nothing and no one that is hopeless. The next one is Big James, the son of Zebedee. He's one of Peter's closest friends. He's part of the inner three. James got to witness things others didn't. He got to witness Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. He got to witness the Jairus' daughter being raised from the dead. He and his brother were fiery, ambitious. And that's why Jesus gave them the most epic nickname, the Sons of Thunder. He's bold. He's an alpha. He's ambitious. One time when the Samaritan village, they disrespected Jesus. I love this. I love that James and John said to Jesus in Luke chapter 9, when the disciples, James and John, saw this, they asked, Lord, do you want us to call fire down from heaven to destroy them? I just love that verse. But Jesus, I'm not going to tell you why, but I do. But Jesus is like, guys, just lay off the testosterone and the creatine, guys. I mean, this is too much. But he was one of the first apostles to be martyred. Acts chapter 6, verse 12. He was beheaded by King Agrippa. Some of you can relate to James' temperament because he's got a big personality. Maybe people have told you, look, your personality's too big for us. It's not too big for God. God wants to take you the way you are, the way you're shaped, the way you're wired, to redirect and redeem and renew you for his purposes, just like James. The next one is John. John, the beloved. He's always saying he's the one that Jesus loved. Over and over again, biggest humble brag ever. He's the only disciple that does not die a violent death. He actually died at a really old age. He writes the Gospel of John in 1st, 2nd, 3rd John. He writes the book of Revelation. He died of an old age in Ephesus. He became the first grandfather figure to the early church. You can see it in his epistles because in 1 John, he's saying things like, my dear children, my friends, my beloved. Can I say this? What we learn from John is one of the dangers as we get older is we can accidentally go of one or two ways. We can get angrier and meaner and grouchier, or we can become loving sages. And we learn from the message from John that as he grew old, he became a loving sage. We need more grandfathers, spiritual grandfathers and grandmothers who are spiritual sages. Oftentimes we land too much on the grouchy and the mean part. We need the loving kind. That's that John set the example for. The last one is Simon Peter. We love him because he says dumb stuff. We all say dumb stuff. The different thing is when Peter says it's recorded in the Bible, the best-selling book of all times. He's a natural leader. He's impulsive. He often spoke before thinking. He's a ready, fire, aim kind of guy, so he says a lot of dumb stuff. But he also says some really great things. One day, Jesus asked the disciples, who do they say I am? They're like, well, Elijah or a prophet. He says, but who do you say I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus tells him, he says in Matthew 16, I tell you that you are Peter, on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now, a lot of people think that Jesus is saying that Peter was the rock that he was going to build the church on. No, Peter was a sinner. He was a flawed human being. He denied Jesus 3 times. What Jesus is saying is on the rock of that confession that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God, that's what I'm going to build my church on. In John chapter 6, disciples are deserting Jesus. He asked the 12, you guys going to leave too? And I love Peter's response. He says, Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. He goes on to lead the church in Jerusalem and then in Rome. Tradition tells us he was crucified upside down by Nero in Rome because he didn't want to be crucified the same way Jesus was. He had some great moments. Oftentimes he had great moments and the worst moments in the same day. I mean, can you relate that? He walked on water, sank, same time. And it shows us that he was brave and he was foolish and he was rebuked and repented. Jesus called him Satan at one time and he blessed him other times. Peter denied him even after he said he wouldn't. And Jesus found him and restored him on the beach, and he used him. Listen, guys, you are not defined by your worst moments. Humility that comes from failure will help you withstand the prestige that comes from success, which is why I think Peter tells us that love covers a multitude of sins. Now, as we've walked through the list, I hope you're able to see the parts of these disciples in your own life, and that reassures you. I mean, a word of assurance I want to give you is, if God can use them, why are you setting out? Jesus can use you. Your broken story, your divorce, your addiction, your personality flaw, your strengths, your gifts, your weaknesses. He says, hey, just bring it to me and watch me redeem it and watch me renew it and use it for the kingdom of God. So today, I want to ask you to respond to Jesus then. He's calling individuals out of crowds all the time. And we have a crowd, so he wants to call out individuals. And there's 2 callings here. One, if you've never responded to Jesus as your Lord and Savior, coming to repentance and baptism, then make that decision today. Maybe the others is, you're still sitting on the sidelines. You made that decision, thinking God can never use you. And he wants you to bring your small boat to him and say, let him work through you, not just in you. Maybe you need to respond today with what prophet Isaiah say, here I am, send me. And maybe it's time, maybe it's a job change. Maybe it's you stay at your job. Maybe it's extend an invitation to somebody. Whatever it is, I want to ask you to make that step, make that commitment today and say, God, whatever you need, whatever you've given me, I'm going to use it for your kingdom. So we want to give you that chance. If we